My name is Frank Kodak, and today, July 14th, 2013, I am pleased to have the opportunity to host a conversation about an esteemed member of the law library profession, Robert L. Oakley, for the Oral History and Law Librarianship Project. Before his untimely death at the age of 62 in 2007, Bob Oakley charted a path in the profession that was both influential and awe-inspiring. It would be impossible to list all of his accomplishments, but here are a few highlights from a career that spanned nearly 4 decades. He served as the director of 2 major academic law libraries, Boston University and Georgetown University Law Center. He was a member of the AALL Executive Board 1991 to 94 and subsequently served as AALL president in 2000-2001. He chaired the AALL Special Committee on National Information Policy in 1988 to 90, which served as the catalyst for the creation of the association's Government Relations Program. In support of that program, he served as AALL's first Washington Affairs representative from 1990 until his death in 2007. He frequently wrote and spoke about critical issues such as public access to government information, copyright in libraries, preservation of legal information, and the future of libraries. Outside of AALL, he was a member of the Network Advisory Committee for the Library of Congress for 6 years in 1986 to 92. He served on the Depository Library Council, the ALS Committee on Libraries, and the IFLA Committee on Copyright. And he convened an invitational conference in 2003, Preserving Legal Information for the 21st Century, which led to the formation of the Legal Information Preservation Alliance. These kinds of professional contributions do not go unnoticed. Among the awards presented to Bob Oakley were 2 AALL Presidential Certificates of Merit in 1999 and 2003. And posthumously, he received the Frederick Charles Hicks Award for Outstanding Contributions to Academic Law Librarianship, and AALL's highest honor, the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award, both in 2008. He was also the first recipient of AALL's Member Advocacy Award, which was subsequently renamed in his honor in 2009. And in 2010, he was a member of the inaugural class of inductees into the AALL Hall of Fame. Joining me this afternoon in a suite at the Sheraton Hotel in Washington, Seattle, Washington, the site of the 2013 AALL annual meeting, are 4 individuals who knew and worked with Bob Oakley in a variety of ways for many years. I am pleased to welcome Mary Alice Bache, Assistant Public Printer, Superintendent of Documents, U.S. Government Printing Office. From 1994 to 2010, she served AALL as Assistant Associate and Acting Washington Affairs Representative, and eventually as the Association's Director of Government Relations. Darcy Kirk, Associate Dean for Library and Technology and Professor of Law, University of Connecticut School of Law. Prior to coming to Connecticut, Darcy was the Associate Law Librarian for Public Services at Georgetown University Law Center from 1990 to 96. Darcy was President of AALL in 2011-12. Margie May is Executive Director of the Legal Information Preservation Alliance and AALL Vendor Liaison. Previously, she was Associate Director for Information Resources at the University of St. Thomas Law Library and Associate Director for Collections and Technical Services at the University of Minnesota. Margie served as AALL President in 1999 to 2000. And Susan Toulis, Associate Dean for Information Services, Southern Illinois University Morris Library. Susan served as Government Documents Librarian at the University of Virginia Law Library from 1982 to 1997, with the exception of the years 92 to 94, when she worked in Washington, D.C. as AALL's first Assistant Washington Affairs Representative. So that's the lineup. Yes.
I remember exactly when I met Bob for the first time. It was 1983 at the Houston annual meeting. I had recently gone to work at Cornell Law Library the prior fall, and at that time the Cornell librarians had a tradition of meeting for dinner during the annual meeting and inviting former colleagues to join them. So I had been hearing about the dinner we were going to have in Houston and the former librarians from Cornell who were going to join them, and among that group was Bob Oakley, who was, although sort of young in his career, he was an up-and-coming, young director, was already charting a path of leadership, and frankly, I was a little bit intimidated about the idea that I was going to meet Bob Oakley. And so I went to this dinner, and there he was, larger than life in some ways, but just warm and gracious and welcoming. And we had a delightful evening with our other Cornell colleagues, and forever after that, I think we had a special relationship because of that Cornell connection, because we had a strong feeling about Cornell and what it meant to each of us. So that was a happy moment, which means that I knew him for a very long time, and we worked together subsequently on a number of issues and groups and committees, but I've never forgotten that initial meeting.
Very good. Who else remembers when they first met Bob?
Well, I can talk. I wasn't in the law library profession for a number of years prior to being at a law library, but I was very active in government documents, and so I was involved in the Government Documents Roundtable within the American Library Association, and because I only lived 2 hours from DC, whenever we needed someone from Godor to represent us in DC, I was the one who drove to DC. So somewhere in the mid-'80s, the various library associations, ALA, AALL, ARL, were getting together to try to work together to influence, federal information policy. I mean, at that point, we were still getting microfiche and paper, and we knew electronic was coming down the pike, and so wouldn't it be great if we could start working on changing Title 44? At that point, we still haven't changed Title 44, but that's another story. But Bob was always the one representing AALL at those meetings, and in 1989, 1990, when I was chair of the Government Documents Roundtable, is when I probably spent the most amount of time working with Bob. So
I can follow up on that because of our close connection with Bob. So you mentioned government information policy. I first met Bob, we had moved from New Jersey to DC. I worked at American University, not in a law library, unfortunately. But Bob was on the Depository Library Council at that period of time from 1990 to 1993. And at the time, the meetings were held with maybe about 20 people came. Susan was always there, and the meetings were at the U.S. Government Printing Office. And so, while I didn't get to know him well, I saw him in action as a member of the advisory committee to the public printer. And the second, I just want to go into the second time I met him, like Susan, who came to DC a lot to help speak about policy issues. The ALA Washington office pulled me into policy issues. And I can remember, I was at my first AAA was in Reno in 1989. I didn't meet Bob there, but I subsequently was asked to speak at a policy discussion, and this would be about 1993 or 1994, and it was held at the U.S. Department of Labor auditorium. And it was on an issue I'm thinking might have been the discussions leading up to the Paperwork Reduction Act or something like that. And I didn't know that AAA had any policy activity at all in Washington, D.C. And Bob got up as a speaker on behalf of the American Association of Law Libraries, and in his intelligent, authoritative way, offered remarks without having a note, at his hands, just that were just incredibly important. And at the time I thought, wow, AALL, look at how active they are on federal information policy, and I was so impressed. And then later on had the opportunity and honor to follow Susan working for Bob and AALL.
So what year did he start at Georgetown?
83, I believe, 1983.
Fortunately, I have some notes here which tell me 1982 he started at Georgetown.
So I think that, well, for one thing, I became a law librarian in 1980, or maybe it was 81. or sort of in between 1980 and 81, somewhere in that academic year. And I went to my first annual meeting, which was in Washington that year in 1981. And I didn't come from a law library that really was nationally involved.
You were at Boston
I
College.
was at Boston
then?
College Law School Library, yes. But I went to that meeting and I was very excited about the meeting. It actually was the first professional meeting I'd ever been to. I had worked as a non-law librarian for 10 years and was never important enough to go to a professional meeting. So it was my very first professional meeting, much less a national meeting. And so I was sort of all eyes, and I just sort of noticed, there were just certain people who were clearly movers and shakers, even without being told who they were, And I remember there were, and so I heard of Bob pretty early on. I heard about sort of a whole class of directors who were very young, sort of maybe had been, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years out of law school and were already new directors. And they had all become directors sort of quite early in the 80s, and so, or even before that. And he was one of them. And I also knew that he was at BU, so I sort of had that connection. And then I would go to the Law Librarians of New England meeting, and there was a sort of a culture there where the directors would sort of go for maybe the first program. They would disappear, So we're like, where did they go, And, but Bob would go running. And so he would come in towards the end of the Law Librarians of New England meeting with his running clothes on, It's like, that's where Bob had been, running along the Charles River or something like that. So, but I just always liked him. And so I know at some point we just, we got to chatting, who knows, over a program or something like that. So I would say that's sort of how I first got to know Bob.
Very good. So let's, we've already begun to touch on some of Bob's areas of interest and work, but let's try to focus. So I'm going to throw out areas, and to the extent that you have something to add, either just your knowledge about what Bob did in a particular area, or hopefully also perhaps some personal contact with him in those areas, that would be of interest. So areas that were of interest to him in which he made valuable contributions. The first one, a very obvious one, has already been touched on, but let's get a little bit more specific, and that would be public access to government information. So I'll throw that topic out there, and feel free to jump in and tell us what you have, what your recollections are of Bob in that area, that arena.
Well, because of working, mostly for ALA, I think ALA even looked to Bob for his expertise in the issues that we were all concerned with at that time. And it was great. And somebody mentioned already, Bob was very quiet about a lot of things, but it was clear. He had this vast knowledge of the issues and could speak on it. And, for me, when I went to work for him, it was unbelievable. I still some days think, I don't know how I managed to do that.
And just to clarify, you were the first assistant Washington Affairs representative for ALL, and you worked with Bob.
Yes, and at that time my office was in Georgetown Law Library, so just down the hall, sort of, or across the hall from Bob. But this was a new thing, and we were both sort of feeling through the process. And basically I was hired on a 1-year appointment so that the association could determine if they needed an assistant Washington Affairs representative in DC. Of course, after however many months it was, 9 months, we had to write a report that said yes or no, and obviously we said yes. And I ended up staying close to 2 years working for Bob. But I felt like Bob and I worked so well together because I knew there were people in DC that I knew through my connections with Godord that he didn't necessarily know, but he also knew others in DC, like on Capitol Hill, whether it's a staff person for a congressional committee or whether it was other people at other nonprofit associations in DC. So between the two of us, we could work the system. Shouldn't say it quite that way, but where I felt like I lacked was the in-depth knowledge that Bob had. So like oftentimes I would have to write a draft statement for him. So, I mean, I could do the bare bones, and then he would say, okay, we need to insert in here more about this topic or this topic. And I learned so much from him that I can't even begin.
As did I, and when you talked about his editing, your writing, as he edited my writing, it was always in red pen. And, initially, when he returned the draft letter that I prepared, there was more red than typed, I can tell you that, but,
But you didn't take offense at it.
I did not take offense at it.
Nor did I.
Because I think exactly the same things you mentioned, Susan. So Bob taught me everything I knew. I got to know over the 16 years I was with Double A to Love. But initially, and I think the most important thing that he taught me was to be strategic about things. And that very much is the approach. Bob was that strategic person. He was also the visionary. He understood, Susan mentioned reforming Title 44 back when he was on council, 23 years ago, actually. And as Susan mentioned, we're still working on making that happen. But he really knew what the landscape was going to look like in the future. And it's that sort of strategic visioning, and then how do you get there? And also, Susan mentioned the importance of the collaboration among the 5 National Library Associations. Bob was very much the leader on copyright among all 5 of them, and working, with Bob, we had for many, many years a coalition of all 5 library associations. And he understood the importance that we always speak with one voice. We can't afford among the 5 National Library Associations to have different messages to the Hill. And I think that was one of his wonderful strengths, just the kind of person that he was in being able to make everybody understand complex issues in a simple way, and also just his wonderful, kind personality that wanted people to work together. He led that and I think that's a significant achievement.
So Margie, I think you were on the board at the same time that Bob was on the board, and I'm wondering if he was the one who and that was also kind of the beginning of ALL's formal Washington Affairs program in the early 90s after the National Information Policy Committee report, and he was now, in addition to being a board member, he was the Washington Affairs representative, and I'm wondering if he kind of introduced the board to the importance of public access to government information.
Well, I think the board had taken a big step forward following the National Information Policy Committee's recommendation. They had appointed Bob as the first Washington Affairs representative, but that was, a part-time position that Bob probably spent, full-time on, as many of our volunteers often do, that he really created a Washington presence and would report back to the board. And in less than 2 years, the board became convinced that this was becoming so successful that we needed the full-time staff to continue to support the program. I just echo what Susan and Mary Alice have said, his ability to articulate the issues, from a scribbled line on a note card in front of him, he would explain the issues in a way that everyone could understand why they were important to us, why access to government information was important, and why, some piece of legislation or movement might endanger our access to government information, and therefore we should take a position on it. He was instrumental in developing the first government information policy for the association and in really moving the program forward and bringing the board along with him to understand what it would mean for us as an association and ultimately for our members, of course, in the workplace to be able to provide open access to government information and a whole host of other issues related to information policy. His ability to distill you know, the meat of an argument or an issue was incredible.
Yeah, and I can also echo what Marty said about, I sat on the board as secretary, I can't remember what those years were, but Bob was still alive, and, you know, and even though I had worked with him, I sort of sat mesmerized at the board table when he spoke, because not only was he, as you say, sort of authoritative and articulate, but he just had a wealth of knowledge that he would sort of bring to bear on any topic, and was just, I sort of would want to just put it all into my head, you know, and I just couldn't, you know, but he was just great.
And if I could go back to my early board service, the third year of my service, when Bob had rotated off, the board voted to bring the Washington Affairs representative to every board meeting,
Right.
so that we could continue to have that report from him, because it was so important. It was the only way the board was going to understand in depth the kind of issues that we were dealing with and that he was dealing with for us in Washington. So that continued. He attended board meetings throughout the rest of his career.
Great. So we've been talking about some of the issues that were important to Bob, and public access to government information. I think right from the very beginning, clearly that was one. But another very important issue, one he was very active in, it's already been touched upon just a little by Mary Alice, but was copyright protections and fair use. And I think you made the point about he was really the point person, not just for ALL, but for all of the library associations. I'd welcome any comments or observations you might have.
Well, I
about
can
his
tell
interest in
you
that.
from 95 to 2001, when the Supreme Court oral argument on copyright term extension, during that period of 6 or 7 years, Bob really had to concentrate almost all of his double-8-able time, which Marty has said was a lot of his 40-plus hour work week, on copyright. We had things like database protection that we were fighting to stop, and that took, I think, 6 years with the U.S. Congress. We had copyright term extension, and that's when Bob had a wonderful relationship with Mary Beth, the Register of Copyright, and he was also able to position himself to be viewed as sort of a neutral party, because he also understood the interest of publishers and copyright owners, you know what I'm saying? And yes, yeah, is fair use important? Absolutely. Those were the key issues that were so important to everything he did as a library director, as Washington Affairs representative, and I just think it was almost part of his humanity to be passionate about all of that. But he was a major player representing all the library associations, so he was our spokesperson. And I think that his contributions were invaluable to the outcome of many of the battles over Section 108 and fair use and database protection.
And in addition to his advocacy work, he wrote scholarly pieces on copyright. So
Much of his scholarship actually was in the area of
yes, and
copyright.
so I think that contributed to the respect that he had from the other library associations and frankly from the publishers.
He really had a national reputation as an expert on copyright. And I know he went to WIPO meetings where he testified, and I mean, people would call on him, you know, a lot to just go speak or, you know, provide advice or counsel on copyright. Really, he just knew so much about it.
Well, and I want to echo what Marty just said about the publishers.
Right.
He's one of the few who was respected by what some would consider our opponents.
Yeah.
So.
Preservation of legal information, obviously another very important issue, and I mentioned at the very beginning that he had the conference in 2003, which led directly to the establishment of the Legal Information Preservation Alliance, which we're pleased to have Margie here as the executive director of that. So maybe Margie might want to lead us off on talking about Bob, and that was, and correct me, I probably am wrong about this, knowing Bob, I mean, he was thinking about lots of things from the get-go, but that was sort of at least from the outside, an issue that came later on after he had already been involved in some of these other things, although it's probably a natural outgrowth of some of the things he had been working on.
Well, Bob and I had had conversations for years about a couple of shared interests, collection development broadly speaking, but preservation as a piece of that and how we preserve and protect the collections we're building and developing was an issue that concerned him for a long, long time. And he became frustrated by our inability as a profession, as an association, to really grapple with that, to come up with a national preservation agenda, to agree on what needed to be preserved and how to do it. And around the time that he and the librarians at Georgetown developed this conference in 2003, we were also beginning to be worried about born digital material that was being lost. So I guess it was, perhaps from the outside, it seemed like a late in life issue for him, but I think it had always been on his mind. And because we as a profession did not seem to be able to agree on how to move forward on it, he said, well, okay, we're going to do a conference at Georgetown. He got AALL to be a co-sponsor. They created an invitational conference where people were invited to give papers, but all along it was designed to create an action plan or an agenda for further work. And out of that conference, indeed, came the Legal Information Preservation Alliance, which operated as a strictly volunteer organization for several years before I was hired as a staff person. And Bob did almost all of the recruiting of member libraries, 20 founding libraries, and now we're over 100. His efforts in describing a mission and articulating the reasons for it to be concerned about both print and digital preservation were, like his contributions in the information policy arena, always, well thought out, articulated, drawing people in, making them understand the issue. And I've not ever had a conference experience like that, where people were invited for the purpose of creating a national plan or agenda, and then it worked. And it was created, and we moved forward. And it's all about Bob. The leadership that he provided for that is the reason LIPA exists today.
Certainly, it's true that AALL and individual AALL members have been talking about preservation for many years, and a couple people do come to mind who focused on that issue. And but I think correct in saying that it never really did get off the ground. You just really couldn't get any traction, and it took that conference. I will also say that I was editor of Law Library Journal at the time, and even though it was an invitational conference, it was clear from the very beginning that Bob wanted what happened at that conference to be shared widely. Right. So he asked me, and I was more than happy to publish many of the papers that were presented at that conference. So that now they're available for anyone to see. But I thought, and especially as you remind me of it, very emblematic of his approach to things and his ability to lead. Any other thoughts from folks
Just
about
a quick
preservation?
one that I wanted to add to the preservation. I think he was, from the time I met him and went to work for him at Georgetown, preservation was always a high priority. But as I mentioned, we had significant copyright and IP battles from about 95, 96 through copyright term. And so he really had to direct his energies to copyright. So it was after the Supreme Court decision on copyright term extension, 2001, that he was able to spend time, and I think maybe that's what propelled it. I also want to add, not only was he very concerned about preserving the print, but he had the vision of the importance of law libraries and others, I think this is a role for GPO as well, to harvest content off agency websites. And so he hired a librarian to develop what I think is the Chesapeake Project. And that was the first sort of coordinated effort, a strategic effort, I might add, to go out and harvest federal agency websites as well as websites, I think, of Maryland, maybe DC and Virginia as well. And that's a significant achievement that has been written about a lot and continues to exist from Georgetown Library.
In the library, he had a strong focus on preservation, and we had a robust preservation staff who were leaders themselves in the field, and a huge microfiche and film, et cetera, collection, and also his collection development strengths, which I don't know if we'll talk about later, or
We can talk about it right now.
talk about it right now. I mean, he was, Margie alluded to it. He was, again, he just had this amazing collection development, sort of a vision of what law libraries should be, but also just a knowledge of the materials, which was just tremendous. And I had learned a lot at Boston College, where I was, among other things, the collection development librarian, but obviously a smaller library. And I came to Georgetown, and I was sort of blown away by, of course, the collection, but also how he had built it, and he truly had built that collection. And I remember when, and we had a collection development committee that met, feels like once a week. I don't think it was that often, but it was quite often, and the meetings would last quite a long time. And every single one of them, I came out of just learning something new every single time. And I remember when I left Georgetown to go to the University of Connecticut, and I said, so, what should I do first? And he said, get your collection in hand. He said, if you get your collection in hand, then everything else will follow. And people, nowadays people might sort of disagree with that approach, but it was very good advice, and he just did. I mean, he just knew exactly what he had in that collection and where it was going to go.
I think that some of the things you said are a good segue into kind of another area that I identified as one that I think was important to Bob that I wanted to bring out and get your thoughts about. And that was a kind of a larger visionary, the future of law libraries and law librarians and law librarianship. Because that was one of the areas that he actually wrote about in addition to copyright, was the future of law libraries. So, and he was involved in, I believe, one of the AL special committees on that. So I don't know if anyone has a thought about that area, but throw that topic out for your consideration.
All right, I'll jump in again.
Yeah, that's fine.
It is, and it was not a committee that he worked on, it was a committee that he appointed. Future of Law Libraries in the Digital Age was one of his presidential initiatives. And I should add that Bob followed me as president, so we worked very closely together twice on the board, but certainly the relationship between a president and vice president is I would say, probably the closest in the association. We work very, very actively together on a lot of initiatives, but as Frank said, Bob really had an interest in having people be more visionary about what was coming in librarianship and putting some tools in place to help people think about the future of law libraries. So he created a special committee that spent a year working, and of course he was so interested in the topic that he came to our meetings and contributed his own ideas, and it produced a fabulous report. And I think it just showed that it's another indication of the breadth of his interests, that he had what you might call some pretty narrow interests, like copyright, pretty scholarly, doctrinal law interests, and then he had this more visionary side of him. And one of the ways that manifested itself was that he loved to talk to younger law librarians. He loved to know why people were in the profession, what they hoped to get out of it, and that was part of his view of the future, was these are the people who are going to follow us. Let's find out what they're thinking. And so I think he just had a really almost endless interest in the whole scope of librarianship, but in particular in leaving law librarians and the association with some sort of vision of what the future might bring.
Very well stated. Thank you for correcting me.
I'd like to just add, I know from other people exactly what you say, because I think Bob went to all the Gen X, Gen Y meetings at conferences. That's where he probably would meet the younger set of newer librarians and find out from them, what their views were and why they came into the profession, what their expectations might be.
He recognized early on how a newer generation of libraries was going to view our work and our services differently, and he wanted to be able to respond to that.
Very good.
He also, as a manager, was very much, I think the visionary part of him played into sort of, he was a risk taker. So, I remember the very first meeting I had with him after I started there, and I sat down and, I expected him to either give me a list of things he wanted me to do or something. And he just sort of said, I think he said something about increasing our, getting the reference librarians out of their office or something like that. But mostly what he said was, I'll give you enough rope to hang yourself. I'll never forget that as long as I live. Because I said sort of, how much do you want me to check in? And that was his answer. I, Bob, hired you. I think you're great. Just go do it, and sort of come back, when you need, when you have a question. But it was just, he had a lot of faith in the staff. He believed in us, and I've used that same management style, obviously to some extent, not always, with my own staff, because I think the more you give them freedom, the more they're going to be creative and innovative and visionary themselves. And that I learned, so in those 6 years at Georgetown, I learned just like mountains of knowledge and abilities, and I grew as a manager and as a librarian. It was really all because of him.
And I think that manifested itself in his association work as well.
Yeah.
His view as a committee chair or as president was give people a great assignment and then let them run with it. And I think it made us all better leaders as a result.
Well, I'm pleased to say that none of you have hanged yourself yet. But another great segue, because my last sort of topic that, or of interest of Bob's that I wanted to bring up was something that I think I can already tell from the comments that you've made to really relate to each one of you, and that is his interest in mentoring and also public service, kind of joining those two together or one or the other. So I'll throw that topic out for you, mentoring and public service.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I was mentored by Bob, and yet I was elected president the year before he was. So in that sense, as the president always sort of mentors the person coming behind us. Fortunately, we were really close friends and had worked together for a long time at that point. But I think that's really true. I think you could get probably half of the collective membership here in Seattle at this annual meeting together, and they would say they felt like they had been mentored by Bob in one way or another, whether it was just as a role model or people who had actually worked with him or served on committees with him or simply read the scope of what he had done and aspired to do similar things. I think he really was a strong mentor.
Another way to approach mentorship to me, when I think of Bob, he inspired us all to do better and to be more strategic. And as you said, I'm giving you the long rope and giving you the opportunity to be creative and innovative, and he trusted us as well too. And I think those are great attributes of a wonderful leader.
Well, and he wasn't going to hire somebody that he didn't think could produce for him. So it's like you said, he hired you because you were good. So now go ahead and show me what you can do.
Right.
It's interesting, you mentioned you being elected president before him. I think in some respects that probably was a consequence of his heavy load of public service, because I think there was some thing about, well, we can't elect him president because then Washington is elected, right? And then, of course, Mary Alice stepped in as acting
Right, because he had to step down
That's
from
right.
that position the year he was president.
Yeah. Very good.
Right, in fact, I remember him telling me that they had asked him to run for president any number of times, and he had just sort of said, I need to find the time to be able to do it. Yeah, so.
So we've already been doing this, but I want to switch gears a little bit, get off of the idea of these big topics. And you were all, it's clear, close personal friends with Bob Oakley. Perhaps everyone who knew him felt that they were a close personal friend, and probably it was true. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit, you've already begun to do that, about some of his personal traits and interests, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if there are any stories or anecdotes that come to mind that you want to share with us, that would be great as well. But kind of sort of, what was Bob like?
Kind. I would say
That's
that
good,
in
I
a
like that.
nutshell.
One word. Bob in
Absolutely,
one word.
absolutely, and very understanding and easy to talk to. And, I was so intimidated by him for the first couple of years, but as we got to know each other better and could even begin talking about personal things and family things, and I don't know, he was also, in addition to kind, he was very sensitive, I think. For all this wonderful aura and getting up and speaking to copyright committees and testifying before Congress, there was this other side of him that maybe wasn't quite so known by so many people, but I think we had that wonderful opportunity of knowing him at that level.
Well, I thought about this as I was flying in, and I think the first thing I was going to say is that he could appear to be soft-spoken, but he was definitely not soft on the issues, and I just thought it was this nice juxtaposition.
Yeah, there was always that distance, that, the boss, staff person relationship. So even though we got closer over those 6 years, there was still that distance. But then after I left in '96 and went to the University of Connecticut, then we could be much more sort of mentor-mentee or whatever. And so we started this tradition of, at the AALS meeting, of having dinner. And it was very, and at first it was sort of awkward for both of us, because it was like, this whole meal alone, just the two of us alone, like, what are we going to talk about, but I think we both wanted to do it, let's try this out, and we did, and very quickly turns out we both liked wine, and we would finish an entire bottle of wine between the two of us, and just have a wonderful, wonderful visit, and we would catch up, we got to know each other's personal lives a little bit, and we'd share about our children and the dog or whatever, and then of course I would talk about work and seek his advice, and it was just lovely, and I just would look forward to that ALS meeting, the next one, and so at ALL, of course, we'd see each other, and maybe we would be in a program or whatever, but it was that ALS meeting that I looked forward to every year.
Kind of some private time.
Yeah.
Well, unlike the rest of you, I didn't work with him on a daily basis. My friendship with Bob developed over a long period of time, and over and around issues and interests in common, not just within the association, but aspects of librarianship that we were both interested, as I mentioned earlier, collection development and things like that. So we would talk very sporadically, but during the years that we served on the board or worked on a committee or something together and had more contact, I began to see the other side of Bob, that there was a very fun-loving, he had a great sense of humor, he loved to laugh. Very fun-loving aspect that perhaps a lot of people who just hear him speak don't see. He had personal interests that many people didn't know about. He had once participated in folk dancing, and he was interested in ham radios, and you know, they're not the sort of thing that, that comes up normally in conversation until you get to know someone very well. And it took me a long time to get to have those more personal conversations with him where we would talk about our families and our personal lives. But I always, from the very beginning, found him to be so warm, so interested in other people. And I think that's part of what made him sensitive to, you know, other people's feelings about things. Even though he had strong, you know, feelings about issues, he wanted to acknowledge that everyone didn't have to agree and that people had, you know, other things that they brought to the table on an issue, or, you know, if they had other things going on in their lives besides their association work. So just, and I would say echo kind, but also say very caring.
Baseball. I went to many baseball meetings.
Yes.
Because when we would come to DC for Depository Library Council meetings in the fall, there were a group of us that would always, hopefully the Orioles would be playing, and we would take the train or drive or whatever up to Baltimore, and Bob would always go with us.
We haven't really talked very much about his work on Depository Library Council, but you overlapped with that, and then really you became the Assistant Washington Affairs Representative at, was it the same time you were
Because Bob and I were on
overlapping?
Depository Library Council 1990 to 93, and as you said, I went to DC, became
Washington,
the
DC.
Assistant Washington Affairs Representative, which is always a mouthful, and I think it was 93, 94. And actually, one of the things Bob and I worked on, we spent a lot of time on, and I cannot believe I am now not going to remember the title of this report, but it was Ways to Restructure the Depository Library Program. Do you remember what the title of it is?
No, that Bob, the council did.
Right.
During
Basically,
your
Bob
tenure.
and I did
Right.
it, council signed on to it. But, you know, I mean, we had the luxury because we were both working in the same place at the same time. You know, Bob was bound and determined. We've been talking about these issues and nothing had ever been really written down. And so, you know, there was a smaller subgroup that met to talk about this, and we came up with some ideas, but then it was basically Bob and me working together to flesh all of these various ideas. I mean, obviously one idea was, okay, you can remain the status quo. It was like future ways to restructure the Depository Library Program, but.
Had there been a law librarian on council before that?
Yes, yeah, I think.
Yeah, Jane Hammond had been
Right.
on,
Oh, of course.
and
Mary
How
Parker was on.
I think she was
Oh,
out
she
there,
was-
but there, I
right,
believe,
that was
for sure
later.
Jane
Yes,
Hammond and
Jane,
perhaps
right.
one or two others.
And interesting that you were doing this report on restructuring the program back in 1993. That's before the internet, that's before agency websites, that's
Right.
before all of this concern about how do we preserve all the born digital that you mentioned earlier. So I need to go back and look at that report.
Well, and it is interesting, but it is interesting because someone actually just a year or so ago asked me about it and said, wasn't there some report written?
I think it's another example of his ability to
Forward
recognize and
Right.
look in the
Visionary
future,
kind of
visionary,
thing.
and the leadership thing as well. So I've heard ham radio. I actually had you and I had a personal experience together with Bob and ham radio. We had I can't remember, it was a lunch or dinner with him in DC, and he was going to drop us off maybe at our hotel, and we got in this little VW Bug, as I recall. Can that be right? Anyways, there's the ham radio right there in the car, and I'm going, whoa.
He also
And he
played
went on.
drums.
Huh?
He played
Play
drums.
drums?
Yes.
I don't think I knew.
That maybe was later on, yes, absolutely.
But didn't he in his car have, he must have had like a CD or something, because he and Jeff
Yeah,
Stamber
there you
Yeah.
go.
used
Right.
to
Talk to one
talk to one
another.
another on the highway. And there were a couple of times when I was driving with Bob to some meeting and Jeff was somewhere else, and they would be chatting away, you know, so that was pretty funny.
Very good. Again, I'm going to interject something that was brought up earlier, this idea about his how he would articulate and present things at AL board meetings, probably at Depository Library Council, et cetera. And you've all mentioned, again, how articulate he was, how the command that he had in terms of the knowledge about information about the subject area, and how it was extremely convincing and kind of laid it all out. But the thing that struck me about all that is totally true, but the thing that struck me about it was, well, here was a guy who could basically, he could blow you out of the room, but he didn't do it that way. He presented it in a way that didn't say, I'm so much smarter than you, I know all this, and you just need to do what I'm saying. Right, probably even though he was, but that here's something that I want to share with you, and then let's have a conversation, a discussion about it. And I think it made for a very healthy discussion and approach to these difficult subjects.
And I think that's why, like, the publishers really did respect him. I mean, even if they disagreed with what he said it in a way, he wasn't obnoxious about it, and understood their feeling, their side of it as well, but still was looking out for us.
Well, and I did not list as a topic, you interrupt, but I was just going to throw it out there. I didn't list it as one of the topics, but we could, if we wanted to, talk about relations with publishers. He actually served on a committee that I chaired that drafted the first, what do we call it now?
Guide to Fair Business.
Thank you, Guide to Fair Business Practices. I went to the vendor liaison representative to help me out on that. And he was everything that you've talked about in other contexts. This was basically a working group assigned to an important task, and he was a fabulous contributor
And
to
he
that.
convened the first vendor colloquium as well, yeah.
But the guide came about because the FTC decided no
Yes.
longer to do the guidelines.
Absolutely. And so,
So
ALL,
with that,
Right.
at AAL, with Bob there right in Washington knowing about that, took on the leadership and said, well,
We're
if
gonna
the
do
government's
this,
not
yeah.
going to do it, then it's our responsibility to do it.
okay. I think I may have interrupted you.
Susan mentioned that he was soft-spoken, and I think that was, that's all part of what you were saying about how he would present something. He was never belligerent, or he wasn't a yeller. He was forceful in a soft-spoken way, and because he could articulate the issues so well and so logically, I don't think anybody ever left feeling they'd been talked down to or anything like that. Just we felt educated after he spoke to us. And that's not to say that everything he said at a board meeting was always agreed with or adopted by the board, but it was always respected.
I appreciate that. My very first morning, working at Georgetown for AA, I had a meeting with him like 11 o'clock, and I had no idea what to expect. I hadn't seen him since the interview several months earlier, so I went into his office and sat down, and Bob said to me, okay, so what do you know about chata? So he thought that was the most important thing that I needed to know in my new position. Susan, maybe you had the same conversation. And I admitted, well, I've heard of the case, but I didn't know much about it. And he proceeded to explain all about chata for about 60 minutes. And at the end of that time, and I took my notes, I understood what some of the challenges were going to be in terms of the role of the Joint Committee on Printing, the authorizing committee, which again is in both chambers. Yeah. So anyway, but that that again gets to his sort of strategic ideas. He knew that was the most important thing that I probably knew nothing about. And it was the first item that he chose to share his knowledge with in a wonderful, kind way. But I'll always remember that moment because I was taken aback. What do you say to your new boss? What do you know about chata? Nothing.
If
I
you
know how to
said
spell
nothing,
it,
he
yeah,
would have been
I
understanding.
Well, I pretty much did. Yeah, understanding, absolutely, yes,
Sure.
yeah.
So I think we're sort of nearing the end of our conversation, and I want to make sure that each of you has the opportunity to touch on anything that we haven't managed to bring up through this laundry list of the topics that we've been covering. So is anything that anyone would like to add or remind us about Bob Oakley?
I would just say he was very proud of his kids, and we talked about his kids a lot when I worked with him, and after I worked with him. I think somebody mentioned talking, you did, after, talking about your kids, but he was very, very proud of them.
Well, I'd go back to inspiration and my current position. And Margie was there. I have the picture of Bob that we used at the memorial service. I have it framed. And beneath that, I had paper clipped some of those index cards that he had taken notes on. Peggy Fry, after Bob's death, had to go through his office and was kind enough to give me some of those little double talking notes. He was just brilliant on that. And so what I'm having a very long and challenging day, talking about the restructuring of the depository library program, like 20 years after he came off council. I do look to that photograph and I get inspiration and that, keep on trying kind of attitude.
That's good. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I also have a photograph of Bob on my desk from the board meeting or the annual meeting where I was leaving the presidency and he was coming into the presidency. So it was a photograph taken at the reception before the final banquet. And I also look to it occasionally for inspiration. We talked about Bob's, what a strategic thinker he was in his leadership and the many things that he contributed. And for me in my current work with LIPA, when I'm having a tough time thinking through a problem, I will often think to myself, now what would Bob do? What inspiration can I glean from all the years that I knew him and talked with him about things that will help me move this organization forward? So I think he does continue to inspire, and his impact just won't be forgotten.
Yeah, and I would concur about sort of thinking about Bob. It's sort of like there would just be times when, I'll have just a memory of, being in the office with him or, going out to lunch or, whatever. And it's sort of the same thing, wondering what he would do, with the problem that I'm facing at that moment, and, but also, always feeling thankful that I had, that relationship with him, that, it will never be taken away from me.
Mary Alice, Darcy, Margie, and Susan, on behalf of Pat Keogh, Michelle Wu, and Dick Spinelli, my colleagues with the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to speak with us today about a true law library treasure, and I think you've helped us understand that even better. Bob Oakley, your remarks will be a valuable addition to the project and of interest to both current colleagues and to those who will join the profession in the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.